Frankly, I can't believe Australians are accepting what they're getting from many of their state governments at the moment when it comes to coronavirus restrictions. Just imagine for a moment if John Howard or Tony Abbott were doing this. Imagine if Jeff Kennett had tried to lock his whole state down. They'd never have done it, of course, but if they'd tried, people would have revolted. The unions, the media, the human rights bodies would have been outraged and mobilised. Now, they're all complicit. We have never had so many laws, rules, restrictions and inconveniences placed upon us in peacetime, yet people meekly accept it because they're encouraged to be scared of the zombie virus. This must be the triumph of the nanny state, the risk managers, the health bureaucrats, all those people who want a sugar tax and bans on alcohol and all the rest of it, all those who want to eliminate all health risks. Well, they are having their time for now, until people wake up. I mean, what dire emergency, what life-threatening situation, what horrible crisis for other citizens would justify police turning up at the house of a pregnant woman, a woman who is unarmed, not aggressive, no threat to herself or anyone else, and the police stick her in handcuffs and arrest her?
What on earth? Excuse me, what on earth?
Just put your phone down.
Can you, record this? I'm in my pyjamas.
What's this?
I had an ultrasound in an hour.
Yeah, she's pregnant, so...
Take it easy.
What's this about?
I have an ultrasound in an hour.
Now, you've all seen this by now. You know that Zoe's alleged crime was posting on Facebook about a planned protest against Victoria's extreme lockdown measures. She didn't go to a protest. She didn't say or do anything violent or dangerous. She lives in Ballarat, where there's a stage 3 lockdown, unlike Melbourne's stage 4, and says she didn't know a protest would be illegal. But under the same government that didn't lift a finger to stop a Black Lives Matter protest, we now see police throw the book at even the social media suggestion of a protest against the government's draconian lockdown. Still, Zoe's episode might now do more than any protest.
Also the fact that, it might be a bit of an eye-opener of the human rights and stuff that I'm trying to stand for, and people realising just how out of control things are getting. Like, I'm not a criminal person, and that was very extreme. Like, if the police had have just called me and told me to remove the post, I would have done so. I didn't realise I was doing something wrong, and I just thought it was very extreme under the circumstances and my children to be exposed to stuff like that.
And what about her premier? What about Daniel Andrews, the bloke who's stuffed every stage of this coronavirus challenge? He's a socialist left premier, so you'd think he'd be concerned about human rights, about personal liberty and about heavy-handed policing of government edicts. Not so much.
She posted something on Facebook. Allegedly, she was planning a peaceful protest. Do you think it was a fair arrest?
Well, what I'd say to you is I've not seen the vision. I don't know what, I'm not sure any of us know what she was attempting to incite allegedly. What I can say, though, is Victoria Police will be out, I think, a bit around noon, if not a bit earlier, and they'll be able to speak to all of those matters.
Is there a new policy on approaching potential protesters in this way?
Not that the government is involved in. That's very much a operational matter that Victoria Police, they may have made some decisions on the ground, as it were, but that's not something I can speak to. But they are going to be out, and you'll be able to put those questions to them.
He doesn't know whether it was over the top or not, just a matter for the police. Says he hadn't even seen the vision. For the Premier to ignore this case, to wipe his hands of it, is reckless. Like letting people out of quarantine, as reckless as that, or telling infected people they can leave home for exercise, or perhaps rejecting ADF support. It just fits in with this pattern of mismanagement in Victoria, doesn't it? Andrews was soft on other protests, soft on quarantine and soft on Defence Force help, but he's going to be hard on anyone protesting against him.
There are rules. We're not going to change those rules. Protests are not smart, they're not safe, and they're not lawful. And that's where it's at.
As for the police, they've looked at what happened in Ballarat and they're okay with it. They say this arrest was prompted by the, quote, serious criminal behaviour of inciting an unlawful protest.
You know, I'd be the first to acknowledge the optics, for want of a better description, of arresting a pregnant female. It's never going to look good. I mean, the optics of arresting someone who's pregnant is terrible. And so, of course, we were very keen to understand the circumstances and consider whether or not in all the circumstances that action was appropriate. And I can say to you, based on the briefings that have been provided to me and my colleague, Assistant Commissioner Cindy Millen, we're absolutely satisfied that in those circumstances the members behaved appropriately and in accordance with our policy.
Really? Well, then you might want to look at your policies again, because this was over the top. The response by police is out of all proportion to the scale of the threat and the severity of the alleged offence. But then that's Andrew's Victoria right now, isn't it? The actions of the government, the power of the state, the intrusion of the law is way out of proportion to the scale of the threat and the scope of the health challenge. And you can hear that even in the language used by the police.
So the point really that I want to make is that while this deadly virus doesn't discriminate, we won't discriminate, and we can't discriminate in holding people to account. I'd also make this observation. We take offenders and suspects as we find them.
This deadly virus doesn't discriminate. You see the problem here? These people are exaggerating and misleading. This virus is not deadly to 99% of people infected. In fact, half of the people infected might never know they have it. And it does discriminate. The virus discriminates in favour of the young and healthy. As we've heard from the experts, the mortality rate for children and young adults is effectively zero. It discriminates against the elderly and the sick. It's the very old and the very sick who are most at risk. In fact, they are the only ones who are really at high risk. So they're the people we need to protect. They're the people who we need to focus on. Instead, authorities want to scare everyone, lock everyone down, while the death count continues to mount. Where? In the aged care homes, where curfews are meaningless and lockdowns change nothing. But Daniel Andrews digs himself deeper into the bunker every day.
We have to make all that we have given, all that we've done, all the sacrifice that every single Victorian has made has to count for something. We can't just let that be washed away by opening up too quickly. We've got to do this in a safe and steady way. That's what the science tells us, that's what the doctors tell us, that's what the data tells us. And as difficult as that is to hear, there is no alternative.
Yeah, we could never admit we were wrong and try for a slight easing of restrictions. We just say there's no alternative. There's a million alternatives. It's all about sensible balance. And Victoria has never gone close to striking that. Look at the other states. Look at other countries. Andrews could scrap the curfew for starters. He could get kids back to school for starters. Instead, leaked documents that appeared in the Herald Sun today show that the roadmap out for Victoria is still going to be long and slow, with life not getting even close to normality until there are fewer than 5 infections a day, if that day ever comes. And it's just as bad in Queensland, even though they're almost COVID-free in that state. They won't reopen the border with their southern neighbour until New South Wales has gone a month without any community transmission. A month. Again, if that day ever comes. This stuff is nuts. They will kill any job, divide any family, create any hardship for anyone, except, of course, celebrities and AFL officials. They will do any collateral damage they like in order to pretend they can wipe out the virus. But we know the virus can't and won't be eliminated. I know, according to the polls, most people in Victoria and Queensland and other states like WA support these lockdown measures. Well, I don't think they've been given the right information by their politicians or most of the media. I think they're being spun a line that all they need to do is put up with hardship for a while, then there'll be a vaccine and it'll all be sweet. That's nonsense. The only chance of that happening is if a highly effective vaccine is widely available within months, something that's never happened before. More likely, all the pain and hardship people are suffering now will be for nothing. It will only delay rather than avoid the day that they have to deal with the virus. And it just means that they'll be poorer and more distressed when they eventually do have to open up and find a way to live with COVID-19. I want to go to Melbourne now and catch up with the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, John Roskam. Good to talk to you, Ron. You must be very distressed, John, at the level of government intrusion and laws and restrictions on Victorians, and surprised perhaps at how meekly they seem to be accepting them.
That's exactly right, Chris. As a Victorian, as an Australian, what we saw yesterday with the arrest of Zoe, as a mother, as someone who cares about mental health issues, who cares about the economy, we have seen the heavy-handed police tactics that are being employed across Melbourne and across Victoria. And exactly as you say, people seem to be at this stage largely unconcerned.
And yet the health effectiveness, the necessity to put these measures in place is highly contentious. There are very, very esteemed professionals, epidemiologists around this country and around the world will say that these measures are either pointless or certainly superfluous compared to other simple measures like social distancing and hygiene and the like. Yet it seems that Daniel Andrews wants this environment where his rule is unquestioned. This is the only way you can deal with the virus.
Chris, that's right. And in the last few days here in Melbourne, we've had dozens of leading doctors and surgeons talking about alternatives. And one of the things that's really worrying about the situation in Victoria is it is a black box how decisions are made. We don't know who the Premier is talking to. We don't know who the Chief Health Officer is consulting with. There's very little transparency. There's almost no accountability. As we've talked about and as Australians know, the Premier, Daniel Andrews, has tried to suspend Parliament. He has hidden documents detailing the extent of the problem. We have massive negligence and misfeasance in the hotel quarantine system. And a few days ago, the Premier was handed more longer powers by the Victorian Parliament.
It's so important to debate these issues and the thrash, especially when it's all about striking compromises between society, the economy, health outcomes and the like. And we talk about all those other experts and the other ways to manage this. For instance, virtually all of the health experts tell you that closing schools is the wrong thing to do. There's minimal health risk for children and, of course, you create damage. You harm children by taking them away from the school environment. Yet in Victoria, it's Brett Sutton, the Chief Medical Officer, and Daniel Andrews, the Premier, and they've just been closing schools and keeping them closed at a rate that other schools, other states and other countries have gone out of their way to resist.
That's exactly right, because nowhere in the Western developed world has a program of shutting schools like Victoria. We're parents here in Melbourne trying to homeschool our children while we're continuing to work from home. It's almost impossible. We risk losing a generation of students. And if we were to compare, for example, the Australian approach to, let's call it, the Swedish approach, where they understood that if you close schools, the children and the families most disadvantaged are going to be those who are least advantaged, who are the poorest, who struggle the most. This is a government that, exactly as you said, is meant to be a socialist left government that seems to care very little for the poor, the underprivileged, the unemployed in Victoria.
Well, what are Victorians to do about this if they want to ask questions, voice concerns, share their views with other Victorians? They obviously can't even post on Facebook that they'd like to have a protest in the street, or even if they're standing 1.5 metres apart. What should they do, and what do you believe they will do? What's your sense of your fellow Victorians and how they feel about this?
Oh, look, Victorians are close to breaking. You have seen Michael O'Brien come out today and condemn the process of the arrest that we saw the video of at the start of the program. It looks like, from IPA analysis, that what the Victorian police did and are doing is probably unlawful. The powers that they seek to be exercising, they don't have. And if the state was to be locked down, then arguably the Premier could have done it, but he needed to change the legislation. That's the first reason why this could be unlawful. The second reason why what the police did could be unlawful is that they can't condone, exactly as you identified, the Black Lives Matter protest, and then, on the other hand, take this action against another protest. That is a breach of the rule of law. Now, what Victorians can do is that Zoe is assembling her legal team. There'll be a GoFundMe page set up, and Victorians might like, or Australians might like, to support that. The other thing that we saw over the last few days is that as Victorians contact their local members of parliament, MPs are starting to listen. Dan Andrews only got his draconian arbitrary extension of powers through because the Greens caved in. There were many crossbenchers who listened to the Victorian people. And it's going to be difficult because, as you identified, at the moment, there aren't many outlets to express dissent or to even have a debate.
It's a very worrying situation. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
John Roskam there from the IPA in Melbourne. If you've got concerns, you're in Victoria, share them with other people, because otherwise the politicians will just keep doing this to you regardless of whether it succeeds or fails when it comes to the health outcomes.